So as I said before, our passage this morning is Hosea chapter 2, verses 2 to 23. And like many passages in the Old Testament prophets, this one is not for the faint-hearted. In its opening verse, we're presented with this promiscuous woman, the whoring on her face. That probably refers to all the beauty products that she has applied to herself. The adultery between her breasts, that probably refers to the necklace that she's wearing. The Bible, of course, does not disapprove of either beauty products or necklaces. I talked about that earlier in the year in connection with 1 Peter chapter 3. But the point here is the purpose for which this woman is using them. It's not that she just wants to look nice for her own pleasure. It's not that she wants to look nice for her husband. No, she wants to look nice for some man who is not her husband and with whom she's having a sexual relationship. Indeed, so steeped is this woman in her promiscuity that she's apparently impervious to her husband's remonstrations, to the point that he's actually getting their children involved in the desperate hope that she might at least listen to them. Plead with your mother, plead, he says in that harrowing opening line. As I say, this passage, it does not break us in gently. It doesn't treat us to a few pleasantries before getting down to business. No, as soon as we cross its threshold, this promiscuous woman is, as it were, thrust in our faces. And once we've recovered then from the shock of that and gotten our bearings a little, we perhaps start nodding. Ah, yes, we say. We know what's going on here. We know who this woman is. It's Gomer, poor old Hosea's wife. It's Gomer who's applying the beauty products and wearing the necklace in order to please some Israelite man somewhere in Samaria whom she's sleeping with. And that is indeed a good guess, because Gomer is engaging in that kind of behavior. We know that. But it's incorrect all the same. Gomer has actually receded now into the background and won't re-emerge until chapter 3. No, what we have here in chapter 2 is not Gomer cheating on Hosea and playing around with other men. It's Israel cheating on Yahweh and playing around with other gods. And of course, just that bare infidelity then of Israel toward Yahweh, her saying, middle of verse 5, I will go after my lovers. It's outrageous, isn't it? Just in and of itself, just at the level we've described it as so far this morning, it's outrageous without taking into consideration any aggravating details. But actually there are aggravating details that we can take into consideration here, at least 3 of them. Aggravating detail number 1, Israel takes Yahweh's gifts and gives her lovers credit for them. Israel takes Yahweh's gifts and gives her lovers credit for them. Verse 5, middle of the verse there. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. So imagine a husband. And this husband then, his wife is flirting with another man. And he thinks, and I know what I'll do. I'll order her an expensive new dress from her favorite shop. That'll show her that I love her and that she's better off with me. And so that's what he does. A couple of days later, the parcel arrives at the door. His wife opens the parcel. She immediately loves the dress. But instead of breaking down in tears at this gesture and flinging herself into her husband's arms and apologizing profusely for being such an idiot with that other guy, she gets out her phone and sends a message to that other guy thanking him enthusiastically for the dress. That's what's going on here. That's what Israel is doing. Her bread and water and wool and flax and oil and drink, they all come from one source alone. They come from her husband, Yahweh. And yet she receives them and says, thank you, Baal. You're such a fantastic fertility god. You fill the fields with crops every harvest time. You're amazing, Baal. It's a sickening spectacle. But then aggravating detail number 2, Israel takes Yahweh's gifts and uses them on her lovers. Verse 8. She did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So think again of that wife in my illustration. And on another occasion, then, it's not a dress that comes through the post. It's a voucher from her husband, a voucher for a meal for 2 at a posh restaurant. And she opens it. And instead of saying to her husband, wow, this is great, when shall we go for the meal? Instead of that, she gets on her phone and messages that other guy. Hey, honey, you and I are going to have a date at a posh restaurant soon. And again, that's how Israel is behaving here. She's taking the silver and gold lavished on her by her husband, Yahweh. And with it, she's constructing idols and images for Baal. And then aggravating detail number 3, Israel uses Yahweh's festivals for honoring her lovers. I think verses 11 and 13 go together. So verse 11 refers to various festivals, doesn't it? Which, of course, we know were good and holy and were stipulated in the law of Moses. Verse 13, on the other hand, refers to the feast days of the Baals. And it's probably not then that Israel has on her calendar all Yahweh's dates, all those dates set out in the first 5 books of the Bible, and then has added on top of those a whole load of other dates relating to Baal. No, all the dates are Yahweh's dates, the ones that you'll find in the law of Moses, Passover, Yom Kippur, new moons, etc. But the point is that at those festivals, those Yahweh festivals, Israel is in fact worshipping Baal. So back to the illustration one more time. This wife we've been imagining. And this time then it's her husband's birthday. And she keeps that evening free. And she leaves work early, telling her colleagues, it's my husband's birthday. I'm going off to an evening of celebration. And she drives away from work, but not to her own house, to the house of that other guy, where she does indeed have an evening of celebration, but with him while her husband is absent from the party, even though it's his own birthday. And again, that's how Israel is behaving here, commemorating Yahweh's Sabbaths and holy days and new moons by worshipping Baal. And so I'm saying then that Israel's infidelity toward Yahweh, it's about as outrageous as it can possibly be. In and of itself, it's obviously outrageous, but there are all these aggravating factors as well. But the passage then, it doesn't just describe Israel's infidelity. It also sets out the consequences. Yahweh is not going to stand idly by. There are going to be consequences, and consequences which we can sum up in this sentence. Because of her infidelity, there is going to be for Israel a return to the wilderness. Because of her infidelity, there is going to be for Israel a return to the wilderness. And by the wilderness, then you'll understand I'm not just referring to a certain kind of landscape. I'm referring to a particular chapter in Israel's history, the chapter which followed the Exodus. Israel at that time, you remember, having come out of Egypt under Moses through the 10 plagues, Israel at that time lived in the wilderness. And so what does it mean then that there's going to be a return to the wilderness? Well, we're going to spend the rest of our time answering that question, and we're going to give 2 answers. And first of all, then, it means there's going to be a ruthless stripping away. What does it mean that there's going to be for Israel a return to the wilderness? It means there's going to be a ruthless stripping away. Many years ago, Hannah and I watched a film called The Family Man. Some of you may have seen it. And at the start of the film then, the main character, Jack, splits up with his college girlfriend, Kate, and sets out on his own. And having kind of shown that initial scene, the film then jumps forward, I think about 13 years, and we get a glimpse of Jack's life now. And he's a bachelor living in New York. But anyway, one night he goes to bed in his New York flat, and by some strange magic, he wakes up the next morning in a different life. And he's married to Kate, and they have two children. And I won't give away any spoilers, just in case you ever see the film as to how the rest of it unfolds. But I want you to imagine then that this scenario, I want you to imagine that you spend years achieving certain academic qualifications and then getting into a particular career and then working your way through the ranks of that career until eventually you're very high up and you command a lot of respect in your professional sphere and you have a very comfortable and a very desirable lifestyle with the house and the car and all the rest of it. But then you go to bed one night, and like in the film, by some strange magic, you're propelled out of all of that and into a different life. But in your case, you're simply propelled backwards to an earlier point in your own life. And you wake up then, and the clock has been rewound perhaps 20 or 30 years, and you're a student again. And you wake up back in your student accommodation. And you're there lying in bed, and it's freezing cold because you can't afford to have the heating on in your student flat. But eventually you're brave enough to get out of bed and you wander through to the kitchen then to find some food, and all there is in the cupboard is several tins of beans because that's pretty much what you live on every day as a student. And so you give up on that and you pop to the bathroom, where the first thing that you notice is all the black mold on the walls, which you've reported to the landlord 6 times, but he's done nothing about whatsoever. And then you start getting dressed and thinking about the day ahead, and you look on the calendar on the wall and you've got an exam the next day, and so you've got to spend this day preparing for an exam that will bear absolutely no relation to anything you'll ever do in the rest of your life. And it's all just so depressing, and you just wish then that you could be back in that adult life that you've been living, back in the warm house with the well-stocked kitchen, and with a sense of purpose, going out to a workplace in the morning and achieving things. But all of that has been stripped away from you in a stroke. You're back at square one with nothing to show for all the triumphs and gains of the past 2 or 3 decades. It's a horrible thing. Well, that's kind of what's going to happen to Israel. Look at the threat there in verse 3. Lest I strip her naked and make her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness. But it's literally make her as the wilderness, and probably it means as in the wilderness. So let me just say it again. Lest I strip her naked and make her as in the day she was born, as she was in the wilderness. That's basically what Yahweh is saying there. There in the wilderness, you see, Israel was a newborn nation and was naked, in the sense that nakedness often has in the Bible, destitute. Israel had nothing at that point. No land, no cities, no vineyards, no monarchy, no commerce with other nations. There in the wilderness, Israel had nothing. Israel was stark naked in the imagery of this verse. Now, however, in Hosea's day, the situation is unrecognizable from that. Jeroboam is ruling. Remember, we heard that in the opening verse of the book. Jeroboam is ruling in Israel. Listen to what one commentator says. During the reign of Jeroboam, the northern kingdom enjoyed a time of great economic prosperity, with its political influence in the region coming close to Solomonic levels. In other words, the northern kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam was almost at the heights that the one united kingdom had known under King Solomon. So Israel has come an awful long way now from the dearth and the scarcity and the vulnerability of the wilderness all those centuries earlier. Now she does have a land. Now she does have cities. Now she does have vineyards. She does have a monarchy. She does have commerce with other nations. She has so much. And you see then what Yahweh is threatening there in verse 3. He's saying, if you don't quit the promiscuity with the Baals, if you don't quit all this infidelity, then all that you've gained over these centuries since you were that newborn naked nation in the desert, all that you've gained is going to be ruthlessly stripped away in a stroke, and you're going to be back in the wilderness again, back to square one again, back in your original state of destitute nakedness, as though all the subsequent triumphs and gains had never even happened. And if it's a threatened possibility in verse 3, notice by the time we get to verse 9, it's a certain prospect. Verse 9 begins with the word therefore. Therefore occurs 3 times in this chapter, and in each case, it's Yahweh saying, this is what I'm going to do in response to your infidelity. And here then, therefore, I will take back my grain in its time, and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. And so he's describing there Israel's agricultural and industrial resources being entirely stripped away. Verse 12 expands on that. I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages, which my lovers have given me. And then look at the last part of that verse. I will make them a forest. Forest isn't a great translation. We think of a forest as quite a beautiful, elegant thing, but more like scrubland. I'm talking here about weeds and bushes and infertile lands. I will make them a scrubland, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. I will make them a wasteland overtaken by the beasts of the field. And clearly we're not talking here there about simply a bad harvest or two. We're talking about fields and vineyards here that have been left to rot, taken over by the beasts of the field, which can only mean one thing, that the people have been deported from the land. They've been exiled. They've been taken away. That's what Yahweh is saying is going to happen. And truly then, Israel is going to return to the wilderness, not literally, not in a geographical sense. She's not actually going to go back to that bit of desert near Mount Sinai where she'd been all those centuries earlier. But she's going to be naked and destitute again, impoverished, everything stripped from her, deported to the land of Assyria, no land of her own, no cities, no vineyards, no monarchy, no commerce with the other nations, bereft of everything, languishing in exile, all the years of abundance and plenty, just a dreamlike memory now from her past, all ruthlessly stripped away. And just 2 quick points then relating to this before we move on. And first of all, although this stripping away then of all Israel's resources and assets, this denuding of her, this reducing of her to pitifully impoverished circumstances of the kind that she'd experienced all those centuries earlier in the wilderness, although it is indeed ruthless, because Yahweh is a jilted lover, and jilted lovers don't just nonchalantly shrug their shoulders. Yet even here, we see his characteristic slowness to anger, of which we sang a few minutes ago in Psalm 145. Even here, we see something of his reluctance to punish. Because I referred a moment ago to the therefores in this passage. And I said that the therefore signal Yahweh responding to Israel's infidelity. You're behaving like this, therefore I'm going to ... Well, it's interesting that verse 9 is not the first therefore. It's the second therefore. There's another one earlier on. The first one is actually in verse 6. And what Yahweh says he's going to do to Israel in verse 6 isn't as ruthless. He doesn't there talk about stripping her of everything and making her naked and her being back in the wilderness. So he says, therefore, verse 6, I will hedge up her way with thorns. I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her path. In other words, he's going to, first of all, just try to frustrate Israel and make her disillusioned and dissatisfied with her lovers. I think what this means in historical terms is this. There was going to be a period in between the end of Jeroboam's long reign, that prosperous long reign, in between that and the Assyrians invading and deporting the Israelites. There's going to be a period in between, a period not yet of external aggression from the Assyrians, but just a period of internal instability, a period during which Israel went through king after king after king, each one just having a very, very short reign, and each reign ending with a coup or a bloody assassination. And that's probably then what verses 6 and 7 here are referring to. And it's as if then before Yahweh gets really ruthless with his faithless bride, he tries this. He tries this softer approach, just a period of political turmoil within the nation. Maybe that will be sufficient to shake Israel out of her infatuation with the Baals. And I'm saying that's so marvelously typical of Yahweh, isn't it? To move slowly through the gears of his judgments. Even in the pain of betrayal, he does not fly off the handle. Even then, he doesn't relish being ruthless. And if he can avoid it, he will. What a God this is. Adore him, believer. You've had bosses at work, perhaps, or senior teachers at school, who just seemed to think that their elevated position warranted them being explosive. They just seem to think it comes with the territory. It's your prerogative as an eminent individual to be able to come down like a ton of bricks on anyone you want to do so. And here's the most elevated and eminent being in the whole of reality, the living and true God, the Almighty Yahweh himself. And being ruthless and devastating in judgment is his last resort, I'm saying, to which he turns only when he has exhausted all other options. He tries other things first, and it's only when those fail that in the end, reluctantly, he turns to propelling Israel back into a state of destitution in the wilderness. That's a God worth worshipping, a God who is slow to anger, reluctant to come down like a ton of bricks. Then the second thing here is they're still in New Testament times. God can reverse his people's fortunes in a drastic manner as a result of their unfaithfulness. Still in New Testament times. God can reverse his people's fortunes in a drastic manner because of their unfaithfulness. You think of the church in Ephesus. What a well-established church that becomes over the years. A church to which Paul writes one of his profoundest, most beautiful letters. A church that for some time has Timothy as its minister. But by the time we get to the book of Revelation, we have the Lord Jesus accusing that church of abandoning its first love. It's exchanged Christ for some other object of its affection. And remember what Christ threatens to do to that church? I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent. Chapter 2, verse 5 of Revelation. In the imagery of those early chapters of Revelation, lampstands are churches. So that when Christ threatens to remove the Ephesian lampstand, he's threatening to remove the Ephesian church. It's as simple as that. To strip away all those years of blessing and growth and development and take things back to how they were in those first days of Paul's ministry in Ephesus. A bit like Israel, being back in the wilderness again. And so let's be clear this morning. It's not just Old Testament Israel that could be unfaithful to God and as a result be stripped of everything. It can happen to New Testament churches too. It can happen when New Testament churches lose the gospel. You think of the church in South Wales. South Wales is full of old church buildings. Every village you'll pass an old church building. In most cases, they're standing empty or they're used for some other purpose than the worship of God these days. Why is that? You say it's all the depopulation since the mines closed. Everyone deserted the towns and villages and went to the cities to get jobs, and the church was just a victim of that. No, that's not the reason. You say it's the sweeping changes in people's attitudes and values that took place in the 1960s. The church was the victim of that. No, that's not the reason either. This is the reason. The church in South Wales lost the gospel. It lost the gospel. Read Jeff Thomas's autobiography. And as a boy in the 1940s and 1950s, he would be taken along every Sunday to church and heard nothing about the blood of Christ and about sin and about a day of wrath to come, just moralism, just be a good neighbor, be charitable, all that kind of stuff. And at that point, that early point in the rise of this new moralistic Christianity, those congregations were still huge. Every pew was filled. But it didn't last long. The church had abandoned the true God for another God, a God of its own making, a God who doesn't demand repentance and doesn't send people to hell and doesn't damn his own son on Calvary's cross. And God's response to this infidelity was to strip the church, to take everything away from it, hence the empty buildings in 2025. Hence the marginal, low-key presence that the Church of Christ now has in communities in South Wales that once revolved around the Christian church. May we at NREC never lose the gospel. It happens. It happens. Or we can commit infidelity in other ways. I've visited churches where the name of the game seems to be castigating other churches for all their errors in doctrine and in practice. Sermons full of castigation, prayers full of castigation, conversations full of castigation. And churches like that have also abandoned the true God. What they most love is not the triune God of the Bible. What they most love is their own superiority in their minds to the Arminians down the road and the charismatics down the road and the theistic evolutionists down the road and all the rest of it. And these churches, then, they may have illustrious histories and great reputations within their circles, but God can strip away all of that and plunge them back to square one, the lampstand removed, the return to the wilderness. May we be warned, here at NREC, we must remain loyal and true to our God. What Hosea 2 is describing can still happen. So there's going to be, for Israel, a return to the wilderness. What does that mean? It means there's going to be a ruthless stripping away. But secondly, and much more briefly, it means there's going to be a romantic starting again. It means there's going to be a romantic starting again. Do you remember last week's passage featured a sudden, seismic, utterly unexpected change of emphasis? It occurred in verse 10 of chapter 1. Well, this week's passage does as well. And in this case, then, it occurs in verse 14, where indeed the ESV has a bit of a break. And there, in verse 14, we have the passage's third therefore. Remember, I said there were three therefores in Hosea 2. And remember, again, what I've said, that therefore in this chapter is God indicating that he's going to respond to Israel's infidelity. The first, therefore, in verse 6, remember, is a modest one. He says, there, I will hedge up her way with thorns. So I'm going to frustrate Israel so that she'll see the futility of her lovers. The second, therefore, in verse 9, that's a devastating one. Therefore, I will take back my grain in its time, etc. I'm going to ruthlessly strip away everything Israel has. And so it kind of makes you wonder then with trepidation, doesn't it, what this third, therefore, will involve. Is this going to be a further escalation now, even beyond God stripping Israel of everything that she has? Are we going to encounter now some deeper horror still? Well, wonderfully, the answer is no. The first, therefore, is a modest one in verse 6. The second, therefore, is a devastating one in verse 9. The third, therefore, here in verse 14, is sensationally gracious and tender-hearted. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, Yahweh says. You think, where does that come from? On the face of things, it just doesn't make sense, does it? The last part of verse 13 is that Israel went after her lovers and forgot me. Therefore, Yahweh says, therefore, you dread to think what he's going to say. Therefore, I will allure her. So unexpected. It's so out of the blue. It's so crazy. It's that defiance, isn't it, that we talked about last Sunday. Remember, I said the great theme of Hosea is defiance, not actually Israel defying God, but Yahweh defying Israel's sin to derail him from his gracious purposes. He defies that, and grace, not sin, will have the last words. But notice then, in the second line of verse 14, Yahweh reiterates his intention that Israel should return to the wilderness. And you think, oh, right, well, perhaps the first line with its marvelously gracious feel to it, perhaps that was just a flash in the pan. Perhaps Yahweh is now resuming the tougher tone of those earlier verses. It sounds like it if he's mentioning the wilderness again. But no, he's not resuming the tougher tone of the earlier verses. He's now viewing Israel's time in the wilderness from a different perspective. Not now as a time of destitution and helplessness, but now as a time when the relationship between her and Yahweh was close and intimate. Because to some extent it was in the wilderness. Jeremiah views the wilderness period from that perspective as well. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 2, Yahweh says, I remember the devotion of your youth, Israel, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness, in a land not sown. So the wilderness period, it was a period then of intimacy and closeness between Yahweh and Israel. You get that perspective on it in the Old Testament. And so when Yahweh says here in verse 14, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness. This isn't a threat, again, like the first half of the chapter. I'm going to ruthlessly strip away everything that you have, Israel. No, this is now a promise. I'm going to romantically start again our relationship, Israel. And as the rest of the chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that this is a proper, full-blown replay that Yahweh is talking about. All those centuries earlier, God had, as it were, courted and romanced Israel in the wilderness and then led her into her own land. And the promise here in the second half of Hosea 2 is that he's going to do all of that again. He's going to once again court and romance his people in the wilderness and then lead them into their own lands. Verse 23, I will sow her for myself in the land. So to what is all this referring then? When is this replay of what had happened those centuries ago? When is this going to happen? Well, remember I said last week about the promises at the end of chapter 1 that they look beyond the short-term future to a greater fulfillment much further down the line. And it's the same with these promises here now in the second half of Hosea 2. This replay, as I'm calling it, it wasn't going to happen anytime soon after Hosea's day. But here's the thing I want to impress upon you as we close this morning. It's happening now. It's happening now. And it involves us. We are the replay. We are the replay of that Old Testament story. Our Christian existence right now in 2025 is verse 14 of Hosea 2 in action. Our Christian existence right now is the wilderness. It's the wilderness 2.0, the counterpart to the wilderness period back in Old Testament times. Because we've experienced an exodus, haven't we? Jesus, you remember, on one famous occasion, or Luke actually, on one famous occasion in the Gospels, refers to Jesus' work at the cross as an exodus. Jesus was talking on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and Elijah about the exodus he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. We've experienced an exodus. Jesus Christ, through his death and resurrection, has brought us out of bondage, not bondage to a human king like Pharaoh, but bondage to sin and Satan. We have experienced an exodus. We've been brought out of bondage. And now God courts and romances us. He enables us now to get to know him better and better. He draws us close to himself. He speaks tenderly to us in the language of verse 14. Especially he does that on these occasions. What's going on now? God is having intimate relations with us. He's drawing us close to him. He's speaking tenderly to us. So we've experienced an exodus. Now, this is the wilderness when we're getting to know God more and more closely. And then one day at the end of the age, he's going to lead us into the promised land. And that's what verse 18 is promising. I will make for them a covenant on that day. On that day in the Old Testament prophecy usually refers to the distant future. On that day, so I'll make a covenant on that day with the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the creeping things of the ground. I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and I will make you lie down in safety. He's going to lead us one day into a land which we know from elsewhere in the Bible is this creation restored. He's going to lead us into that, and we'll be safe there, and there'll be no war, and there'll be no conflict, and everything will be harmonious. Verse 21, in that day I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth, and the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil. Again, it's the idea of a land that's so fruitful and fertile, everything working as it should, the crops growing, the land producing. And so I'm saying then that we have here in Hosea this wonderful thing that God, even as he promises judgment upon his people in Hosea's day, he pronounces the romantic starting again of the whole relationship. And I'm saying that has happened and is happening right now. There has been a new Exodus on Good Friday and Easter Sunday. There is now a new wilderness period in which God is alluring us and wooing us and drawing us ever closer to himself. And there's going to be a new entrance into the promised land when we will finally be ushered in to a harmonious, blissful, perfect world. What a God we have. He could have walked away in Hosea's day. He could have said, I'm done with all of this. It's ridiculous. But that's not the defiant God of the Bible. Because of his defiant grace, we are Israel this morning, freed from bondage, getting closer and closer to our God in the wilderness, and destined for the promised land. Amen.